Good evening, dear readers. My name is Drago Bosnic. I'm a geopolitical and military analyst, and tonight we'll be talking about a very, very controversial topic that a lot of people have covered in the last several years. Of course, it is the question of the pandemic or plandemic. You can choose your preference when it comes to that. For those who have not been following or have been sleeping under a rock, we've been living in very interesting times since 2019, and we could even say that that was the last year of some sort of normal existence for most of us on the planet. Ever since then, things have actually gone, well, sideways. So tonight we'll be talking about this topic with our highly esteemed guest, Professor Michel Chossudovsky. Thank you for coming to our show, Professor.
Delighted. Of course, this is a very important topic.
Exactly. So of course, as I mentioned, the pandemic was dominating our lives for at least 2 years or even 3 years. And then, of course, the crisis in Ukraine escalated to the point where it is now, and it could be escalating further, but that's, of course, another topic. Now, you've covered this topic extensively. You've written about it. Many of your colleagues and authors of the global research have written about it. So where do we even start when covering this topic? Should we start from the beginning, or should we start from the moment where they started admitting that a lot of the things that we were told are not really true?
Well, we might start with the initial decision of the world, the WHO and its Director General, Tedros, to impose a public health emergency of international concern on 193 member states of the United Nations and the WHO, and on the basis of 83 cases outside of China. Now, anybody who has some understanding of arithmetics say this is simply incredible. Why would they have a public health emergency at the international level for 83 cases for a virus which at that stage had not, it really hadn't been identified, and we didn't even know whether it existed. Now, I should mention, this was not a decision of the WHO. The WHO is an entity with scientists and doctors and health specialists. 90% have nothing to do with this decision. This was a fraudulent decision, and it was corroborated by the World Economic Forum on the one hand. There was the Gates Foundation, which is buddy-buddy with Tedros, so on. But what this decision entailed was the commencement of a very serious crisis, which affects the future of humanity. Now, I should qualify because it went through several stages. I don't want to, I've gone through the data very carefully, and all the data is of official sources, so that when the WHO then makes another statement in the month of February, it says, that's a statement. It was a press conference, and it was on the 20th of February. And then he says, we are at a very, I'm paraphrasing, I don't have the exact text in front of me, but he said, we are at a very dangerous situation. The epidemic is coming. And we have to, and the door, and yes, then the windows are closing. Okay, there were there was a whole series of statements. How many cases did he have that particular day on the 20th of February? 1,076 worldwide out of China. Again, notorious. Anybody who had some understanding, including the media, would say, well, what on earth is he talking about, this guy? No, but they accepted it. And it was 190 countries accepted the fact that there was a danger based on statements which were totally fraudulent. And then again, a few weeks later, on the 11th of March, it was an official announcement of the lockdown, the confinement of the labor force, the wearing of the mask, social distancing, closures of colleges and universities, sport events, and the number of cases was at that stage ridiculously low, although it was higher than what it was previously. I don't want to get into the details. All this is on record, but I can remember, we're broadcasting from Montreal, that on the 9th of March, 2020, there were 105 cases in Canada, okay, for a population of something of the order of 30 million people. Those are not cumulative cases, mind you. But the World Health Organization puts forth this data, and then you come to the conclusion, what on earth are they talking about? Either they're absolutely stupid, which I don't think they are, but they are corrupt. And this triggered something which was devastating, because it was a mechanism to close down the national economies of 193 member states of the United Nations, on the pretext that they needed to confine the labor force and freeze the workplace with a view to preventing the spread of an epidemic which had not even been documented. But the hidden agenda is they closed down the real economy of those countries. Now, I've been investigating the IMF World Bank programs in a good part of my career, and all the measures, the economic measures that might be imposed at the governmental level, or on recommendation of IMF World Bank structural adjustment programs. Well, this was, in effect, a globalized structural adjustment program with no need to negotiate. It was imposed, and for it to be imposed, it signifies that they had infiltrated the decision-making process of 193 governments, either by pressuring them or bribing them. I can't understand, for instance, that a country like Cuba, which has an advanced system of medical care and analysis and so on, would not say, well, this sounds a little bit fishy. Do we close down our economy on the orders of the World Health Organization? Well, closing down an economy, a real economy, is what the World Bank and the IMF had been doing for several decades prior to that. They trigger bankruptcies and so on. The number of bankruptcies which were resulted from this is without description, and the impact is without description, because confinement of the labor force in countries where a large part of the labor force does not, I'm talking about, let's say, seasonal workers, but India, for instance, people don't have a home. They live in the streets, or they have a tent or whatever. and the measures taken against these populations, which were not in a position to be confined in their homes because they didn't have any homes. They died, and it wasn't reported in the media. Now, the media is complicit in all this because they misinform everybody. They don't say, oh, it's only 83 cases. No, that didn't come out. It's only 179 cases and so on. It didn't come out, but all the reports of the WHO were there to prove it. So there we are. And then the subsequent stage, which I don't want to get into explicitly, is the vaccine. But what on earth are they vaccinating people for? Because they weren't even in position to identify the virus. And they say it, okay? And in fact, the mRNA so-called vaccine is not a vaccine. And that the medical doctors have confirmed that. So in effect, there was no pandemic, but there was, in the second stage, there was a vaccine. And we knew right from the beginning that this vaccine was devastating. We knew it, and we were able to even come up with figures on mortality. And that was in the first few months when it was launched. And now we have a debate in the US Senate. The narrative has changed, which I think is a very important and positive development, but it is limited to a public health crisis. In other words, it's limited to the vaccine, and the even estimates as to how the life expectancy is affected by this so-called vaccine. The numbers at the global level, I've been looking at what's happening worldwide, and something of the order of 70% of the population of the planet have been vaccinated at least twice. Now, the question is, what is the impact of this vaccine at the level of the planet, of the entire planet? Not at the level of the United States. Now, the United States is behind the decision-making process, and it's the FDA, and various other entities of the state which were involved, and they knew. They knew also because the Pfizer report, a secret classified Pfizer report, came out in February. And it is an internal report, but all the entities of the government in the United States had access to that report, and it came up, and the figures from that Pfizer report indicate very clearly that this is a killer vaccine. I can't place it otherwise. I've looked at that report. It's in the hands of many experts. And then we looked at issues of excess mortality. So I should say that by the middle of 2021, okay, let's say June 2021, there was ample evidence to cancel the vaccine, to cancel it, to remove it as a dangerous substance. Now, there again, there was some idiotic narrative on saying, well, these are people have the right to decide whether they want to be vaccinated or not. That is totally irrelevant. This drug is dangerous, and consequently, we don't want people to consume it. But that didn't occur. And in fact, the opposite occurred. People who wanted to travel had to be vaccinated. Schools and universities, they had to be vaccinated. And that was the process of enforcement. And in fact, it was a trigger to not only to morbidity, but also to mortality at the level of the entire planet. So it's this globalization, worldwideization, which is at stake. And it also has I think that the depopulation agenda was there. It's eugenics. There have been many reports on that, but that eugenics doesn't pertain strictly to the vaccine. It also pertains to the closure, not the total closure, but the closure of the real economy of the planet, where 190 countries, with some exceptions, are instructed to keep the labor force at home, freeze the workplace, and only have essential activities prevailing. And that period, which is certainly, well, the crisis officially is over, but the consequences of those, let's say, 2 years from, it was more than 2 years, no, starting in 2020 up to 2024, is devastating, because it means it triggers bankruptcies, it affects the income of certain groups in society, particularly the collapse in real wages. It triggers famine at the level of the entire planet. I've looked into all the data, and the issues is simply devastating. And my book is available. It's in ebook form. It came out in Japanese. My Japanese publisher contacted me, said, and it came out in Japanese. Nobody in the English language publication has offered to publish it, but it is published in an ebook, and I reach more readers from the ebook than I would otherwise with a print version. But what we are dealing with is a crisis of unprecedented nature in world history, and to simply consider this fake, what some people call the plandemic, they have to examine a bit the broader geopolitical implications of that. They have to look at, yeah.
You mentioned the global, how this is actually being pushed by the global system. So back in June 2023, specifically on June 6th, which sort of was the D-Day for global, well, let's say, freedom of choice when it comes to vaccines. The WHO and the EU announced a global system of vaccine passports for what they called future pandemics. So that was a very interesting formulation. So what they essentially agreed on is to force this, everything that you just mentioned, to force this on all organizations, publicly funded organizations, that a person would have to get a vaccine, no matter how unsafe or unstable the vaccine is. The only way for you to be able to travel freely or to use even your money on your account was to accept the vaccine. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, one of the underlying jokes after the special military operation in Ukraine started was that Putin cured the pandemic. And of course, that was funny enough at the time, because they stopped talking about the pandemic after the Ukrainian conflict escalated. However, what has happened in the meantime, they've used the Ukrainian conflict as a way to pretty much cover all the things that they were planning to implement and enforce on all of us. So in the next 2 years, we've gotten to the point where the WHO has no control. Nobody's able to push back against the agendas that they are pushing on other countries. And the only country, this is the irony, the US was the most important and the largest contributor to the WHO's budget. But now the US has left the WHO. That was one of Trump's first executive orders on January 20th. But still, on May 19th, the WHO took this historic step to enforce new agreements with member countries where they would be forced to pretty much, simply delegate their own sovereignty to the WHO, which can then choose what to do, how to enforce lockdowns, how to pretty much close down the economies, as you said. So this is something that is ongoing, right? This is not something that was happening in 2020 and now it's gone. It's an ongoing process. So how would we? What would you suggest to people who don't want to live like this? What can we do to prevent the WHO and similar organizations from pretty much controlling our lives?
Well, I think there's something important behind what you say. It's not the WHO that calls the shots. It is a few leaders within the WHO who are co-opted by billionaire foundations. In this case, it's Bill Gates. Bill Gates and Tedros are buddies. And again, the decision-making process is also with the World Economic Forum. Now, I've examined all those documents very carefully. When was the vaccine announced that they were working on a vaccine? The organization which was responsible to implementing the vaccine, the COVID vaccine, stated it was more or less the 20th of January 2020 when they met in Davos. And he made the statement, we started working on the vaccine in early 2020. In early 2019. In other words, 1 year before they were already planning the vaccination. And there had been no announcement on and confirmation of actually an epidemic until much later in the month of February. That's really when it was announced. But there was, and the virus doesn't exist. Now that's a subject in its own right. I've gone through it very, very carefully. The virus, which is called, bear in mind, COVID-19 is the impact of the virus. Now, SARS-CoV-2. SARS-CoV-2 is the virus. They renamed it. And what is the 2? It refers to the fact that there was a virus called SARS-CoV, which was registered 10 years earlier in 2003. And they simply said, oh, well, this one is similar. Now, it's complex, but if it's similar, then it's not new by any means, okay? But again, all the documents that were put forth pointed to the fact that even if there is a virus, which they were never able to isolate, it is not a dangerous, it is a coronavirus, some of which are similar to common cold or seasonal influenza. There was nothing in the statements pointing to a deadly virus, that the virus would justify these measures. And so again, this was a political this is what they're to scare the wits out of people. You know, they can't have family reunions. They even abolish Christmas reunions. They have to keep distance in relation to their neighbors. They have to wear masks and more. And the impacts, this was an engineered social, economic, political, and cultural crisis at the level of the entire planet. And it required decision makers which were complicit as well, or who accepted to be bribed. Now, how is it that I'm not a politician, but I have a degree in statistics, but which helps. But you don't need advanced statistics to say, well, this statement by Tedros is idiotic. Now, Tedros should have been should have been dismissed a long time ago. So the issue is not the WHO or the UN. These organizations, we want to keep those organizations. What we want is to avoid their criminalization, and that's what's happening at the highest levels. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's an interesting suggestion, and I certainly agree that we should, at the very least, we should keep these organizations in check, because as it stands now, these organizations have unlimited power. And the craziest thing, I would say that the craziest thing is that the governments have delegated their own sovereignty to an organization that is not really, even though it markets itself as such, it is not a UN run institution. It is run by global Big Pharma, by global private enterprises that are interested in a total, well, I'm not going to say chaos, but the issue is, if we have organizations who are actually thriving in a world full of pandemics and instability of this kind, when we will have those pandemics because it is in their interest to have those. And if they're partners in the military-industrial complex, if the only way for them to maintain power and influence is to have wars, we will have wars. And in the last 5 years or longer, this is exactly what we've had. We've had a combination of pandemics and wars that have escalated to a point of, I'm not going to say World War III, but it might as well happen at some point if things escalate. So, I mean, what are the mechanisms that regular people can use to push back against this? Because obviously, our governments are not going to do this. Our governments are compliant with the demands of the WHO and similar organizations. And also, as you mentioned, people like Bill Gates and these very, very powerful billionaires, people who have, they wield enormous influence, not just on governments, but on entire groups of countries. I mentioned the European Union. The European Union is essentially a bureaucratic dictatorship that forces people to live, their lives the way that the EU wants, not the way that the people themselves want. So what could the regular person do to push back against this, at least to a certain degree? Because, I mean, they can't put us all in jail. They can't even put us all in our houses and jail us in our houses. So should we just refuse? Should we talk about it? Should we try to force our legislators and our governments to push back against this? What can a regular person do to avoid such a disastrous, let's say, lifestyle? Because it's not, I mean, it's not a lifestyle. It's essentially modern slavery.
Well, it's a very complex question because people are misinformed. If they were informed, and that's where we must be targeting the media. If they were informed that there was no virus and there was no pandemic, and all they had to do is to quote the Director General of the WHO, 83 cases. Don't worry, 83 cases. Now, so the corporate media and the government media bear responsibilities. But to go back to the UN system, well, the UN system was established with the support of the Rockefellers going back to the early post-war period. But I mean, it's not to say that the UN actually decides on anything. The UN is a body in the present context which indicates a narrative which they support. But they are in fact violating the UN Charter. There's no question about it. There's in a sense there's a sort of criminalization of the UN system, but it's much more visible, of course, when you look at the WHO. There's criminalization, But that doesn't mean that we want to flog these organizations, okay? Because they are also instruments of protecting humanity and of dialogue and so on. What we want to do is regime change in the WHO, and we want to criminalize. The foundations and the billionaires that ultimately they're involved in crime. There's no question about it. They're involved in crime, and I mean, one thing the media should have informed us on at the time when they introduced the vaccine was the fact that Pfizer has a criminal record with the US Department of Justice. And it's something very serious. It goes back to 2009. And when I say criminal record, they are the only pharmaceutical company in the United States which has a criminal record. And there was even, a mechanism. Well, you know, if you're accused of crime, you may be able to go through a process of being freed on condition that you meet up with where you promise not to do it again and so on. In other words, bear in mind that when this decision was taken, they were targeting the CEOs of Pfizer, and there weren't any prison sentences, but there was an understanding that they would be subject to surveillance and that they should never do this again. That really what it was. Well, they did do it again, and it was 100 times worse. Okay, because this was a Department of Justice decision. Now, if the media had says, be careful of Pfizer, it has a criminal record and it's the only one, you might as well go with somebody else. No, they didn't say that. They said exactly the opposite. And then Pfizer, of course, had the support of every single country, and they pushed out the other vaccine options. The irony in Cuba and in some so-called socialist countries, former socialist countries, they were obliged. They obliged them through bribes and so on to say, no, Pfizer is what you have to do. Pfizer's number one. Well, Pfizer wasn't number one in terms of incidence of mortality and morbidity. I can say that I've looked at that report. Most of the critics who are of the vaccine are familiar with this report. It's devastating. I don't want to. Well, we're limited by time, but I can say that if you read this report as a layperson, you will come to the conclusion that, and it was over a period. They did the analysis over two and a half months, from mid-December of 2020 to the end of February 2021. In other words, it's 2.5 months. And they came up with figures of mortality, morbidity, adverse events, and so on. Numerous elements, numerous causes of mortality. Now, if this report had been analyzed by the media and said, we have this report that says that Pfizer, who used to have a criminal record, back in 2000, I'm paraphrasing what they should have said. Oh, yes, they had a criminal record back in 2009. Mind you, and they said that they wouldn't do it again, that they said sorry, and there were compensations. There was class action. There was a component which was class action. But one has to look at that. That report is available. Everybody should know that Pfizer has a criminal record. And that's why Pfizer has a criminal record. And Mrs. von der Leyen of the European Commission is now being targeted as having criminal relations with Pfizer. And so the media is key to this, because in as much as independent media is censored, we are censored. We're censored. We're censored in the search engines. Hopefully, this program will reach a broader readership. But there is something that even school children can understand on the statements made by the WHO. Okay, I mean, my report is available. My book is available, and it's the problem is that there are a number of individuals who are supported by billionaire foundations, which are there to sustain the interests of powerful financial interests, and this is in several stages. I said the first stage, which was the lockdown, but the lockdown was a process of destabilizing the global economy, which is still ongoing, because the third phase of this is debt. We can see what the debt is, but why is the debt so serious? Why is there a fiscal crisis of the state with virtually in every single Western country? And why are social services collapsing? Why is poverty going up? Well, it has to do with that period, that initial period of the crisis, namely starting in 2020, where essentially there were procedures which literally led to a crisis in commodity trade at the world level. There was a situation of bankruptcies, particularly farmers and small and medium-sized enterprises, but also airlines. And then what happens is, well, we're not in the realm of traditional bankruptcies. It may be Vanguard and BlackRock, which will come up and appropriate as a portfolio giant. They will take over. And at the same time, this is really the end of the sovereign state. Because when 190 countries is not in a position to decide on its public health choices, there's something that means it's some kind of regime change, not the ones that we're experiencing now, but it was based on a specific action, which is that of the World Health Organization coming in and in fact enforcing the closure of the national economies in all these countries. Now, why is it that they didn't know about it? And why is it that they and now we are at the pinnacle of a global economic crisis, where every Western country is indebted, because you also have the dollarization of these economies, which are dependent on the powerful financial interests, the Federal Reserve, the J.P. Morgan Chase, and so on, and essentially what we're living, starting in 2020, is an engineered economic and social crisis at the level of the entire planet, and it has several phases. And the second phase is the vaccine, which has its devastating consequences. And the third phase is the aftermath, which is what is happening today, where essentially the sovereign state or the is virtually bankrupt, and it's not in a.
We could say that this is entirely in line with what you call the privatization of countries. And we could expand that to the privatization of everything, pretty much. It's like a hyper privatization of the entire planet, where as you mentioned, the states are not only losing sovereignty, but they are being pretty much bought or totally controlled by private entities. And in essence, they stop existing, right?
Well, the thing is that process of privatization of the planet has already commenced. And it certainly is linked to the war theater, specifically Ukraine, where BlackRock has already an agreement with Zelensky, going back several years, mind you. But it also is also the privatization of Palestine. People think it's Greater Israel. No, it's not. It's they've already decided that Gaza will become a U.S. territory, and we might have a fake notion that the nation state is still there, but it's not. So the countries are transformed into territories. The citizens of those countries are impoverished. Then there's the whole issue of there are many complexities apart from what we've discussed with regard to the pandemic. There's issues with regard to climate change, okay, with regard to CO2, with regard to energy. Now, I always wonder why on earth would they do they want to take control over the energy of, let's say, Venezuela or Iran, if they consider ideologically that gasoline is something which goes against environmental protection and CO2 and all that. Okay, now we're strung with lies in various dimensions. The environmental dimension is obviously there, where they're trying to convince people that carbon dioxide is deadly and all that, and that's another area of fraud. So there's a whole series of frauds. But what we must do, and which is fundamental, is so to speak to democratize the media, and it's not a question simply of going in and saying, well, the New York Times is this and that. All these news media are controlled by powerful financial interests. And and it's not the journalists. Well, the journalists are some of them, the pundits, are complicit because they're simply not reporting. They're not reporting, or they're falsifying. And if they don't do that, they're out. Now we have to protect. And that's very important. We have to protect the independent media. And we have to spread the word. Protest movements are not going to change unless they are linked up to actions which would question the legitimacy of the major actors. It's not saying let's stop the genocide in Palestine. Trump, please stop the genocide in Palestine. That's not what we have to do. We have to say, the genocide is criminal. Complicity, defined by the Geneva Convention, said complicity as a criminal act. Okay, and then you have the the International Criminal Court that comes up. They don't, and there's not a word about genocide in his statements. So the judicial system is criminalized. Let's understand that. Not international law. International law is not criminalized. Okay, but the actual judicial system is criminalized. They're appointees, and the Anglo-American alliance controls those two courts, the ICC and the International Court of Justice. There we are. Now we have to target them, and we have to, mind you, to get back to the issue of the pandemic. We are dealing, and that's where there's certain similarities. When you implement a vaccine at the level of the entire planet, this is genocide. Why? Because you know that this will lead to mortality. We know it now. But it also applies to the first phase of that crisis, where you close down the planet, its economy. Again, it's not a full-fledged close down, but when you instruct, I have to deal with my colleagues in economics, and they say, well, no, the crisis was due to the virus. Oh, it's the virus that led to the stock market crash. No, it wasn't. We know that those stock markets are manipulated. Ask Soros about that. They are manipulated. It's short selling. It's put options, etc., etc.
So much for free market.
Well, so much for free market, and again, the thing is that there is a criminal agenda in implementing those measures and imposing them on 192 countries. I would say the criminality rests with the recipients, with the governments. Okay, now and now what they're trying to do, they're trying to build a consensus so that these 8 billion people of planet Earth their details will be inserted into an agreement and so on and so forth. It's not clear whether this is going to work out, okay? But definitely this is an area of protest, but you're not going to simply have grassroots protests. The protests have to be within the system, within the governments, within the various entities which compose civil society, within the universities, more at an institutional level. And some of that is occurring now. We're looking at what's happening in the US Senate. They're still honest politicians. We're looking at what is happening in some of the universities and so on. But there has to be some understanding that what has happened is a criminal undertaking which is unprecedented in world history. And it killing people through a fake vaccine, well, the vaccine is a killer. That's I'm not saying it. It's in the Pfizer report. People can go and look at that Pfizer report. And it's documented in my book. Thousands of people have consulted the book, but it is not in print in English. It is available right now in English, French, Spanish, and Japanese as a print edition. But bear in mind, we have to reinforce in independent media, and we have to also start looking at the relations between, let's say, the COVID crisis on the one hand and various other mechanisms which are there to undermine and destroy and to privatize countries and transform them into territories. And that means that everything in a sense, everything is related. But what I wanted to put forth today was the fact that the beginning of this, the firm beginning of the pandemic goes back to early 2020. It was carefully prepared previously, and in fact, it involved a tremendous amount of planning. In other words, that 190 countries actually accepted almost unanimously to go along with this without actually looking at the data, without actually questioning, said, where does it come from? And this is a very corrupt and fraudulent system, but it is not fraudulent at the base of either national governments or institutions of civil society, nor is it at the basis of the United Nations or the World Health Organization. Now, I have worked with many UN agencies in the course of my career, including the World Bank at one time. But these entities, the people who work for them, are not necessarily criminals. The people who use the discourse of the world of the World Trade Center, I'm sorry, not the World Trade Center, the WHO, and for political purposes, because people say, oh, it's the WHO that decided that. It's not the WHO. It didn't decide anything as an entity. Okay, there are thousands of people working for the WHO in these 193 countries. Now, this is a fraudulent gang made up of Ted Ross and his buddy Bill Gates, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And mind you, you'll find their intrusion at different levels. They're certainly at the level of the pandemic and the launching, let's say, of the public health emergency of international concern. The Bill Gates Foundation was funding this. Okay. It was the Virology Institute in Berlin, not the virology of the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Wuhan. Okay, no, it wasn't. And there was a procedure through manipulating concepts to come up with a justification for a pandemic which never existed. And I think that this, you will see it simply by looking at the data. And so
just to add to your point, there are several very, very simple logical questions that a person has to ask themselves to point out what you were saying. Is it logical that a guy like Bill Gates, who for 30 or 40 years has been saying that the planet is overpopulated, that we need to reduce the population, and so on and so on, he's been saying that for 4 decades at least. So now suddenly he says, okay, here I am, I'm going to finance this lovely vaccine that can save your life and prevent the reduction of the population. Would you, if we know that this guy was saying this, is it logical for him to save billions of lives from this supposed virus? And another thing is, there were so many lies said by the companies that produce the vaccines, and one of the most monstrous ones that I can remember is that the vaccine is safe for pregnant women. Now, in order to say that a vaccine is safe for someone, you need to test the vaccine, right? So now I'm wondering which pregnant women or a group of pregnant women were crazy enough to be allowed to allow someone to inject them with an unknown substance to see if this is good for them and their babies. So I don't think there is a group of more than, I don't know, 5 people who would ever accept something like that. And these studies have to be done on thousands and thousands of patients who are willing to risk their lives for private companies or public health institutions to create medication necessary to save people's lives. So apart from all the evidence that you pointed out, I think these very simple logical questions are something that everyone should ask themselves to see if what the government is saying or what a lot of these institutions, corrupt institutions, as you pointed out, are saying, if it's logical or true. So thank you very much, Professor. That was a fascinating analysis as always. Of course, I call upon our readers to follow Lux Media. We'll be posting more of these programs in the future. And of course, I look forward to having you again.
Thank you very much, Drago, and greetings to our readers. We must follow. This is very complex, but we have to follow, and we need initiatives which are broad, and we need to connect the dots, so to speak. And I think one of the most serious things is that people trust their governments. Okay. Well, stop trusting your governments, and the governments have to inform you. And if there's criminality, they have to go after it. They don't have to support it. So we have to decriminalize, so to speak, and we have to ensure that the truth prevails. Because when the lie becomes the truth, there's no moving backwards.
Couldn't agree more. On that note, of course, as you said, we call all our followers to follow and support the Lux Media and, of course, the global research. Thank you very much.
Thank you.